Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched 2015's Sicario. Now, I didn't actually intend to watch this week, but something else came up, and it seemed like the right time. Sicario is a movie that has been on my watch list basically since it came out. Because it's not really my thing, but a very close friend of mine, who I trust very much with their movie recommendations. Um, Basically, I don't need to get into all the details. Basically, said I had to watch this. I haven't. It's now been 6 years, and I'm finally getting around to it. So I feel a little embarrassed about that. But I'm very glad I finally got around to watching it because it's an incredible piece of work. This is directed by Denis Villeneuve, who I don't remember if I've talked about on the show before. To my mind, one of the best directors out there right now, especially for being, I don't want to say a novice, but he doesn't have a super long list of movies he's made. I think it's less than 10. And Sicario is really the first one where he got, I think, a more broad recognition for his talents. It performed very well, despite apparently, I didn't realize this, went up against The Martian, opened the same week, still managed to hold its own and go do very well. So that's a surprise. But between being directed by Denis Villeneuve, who like I said, I think is a truly incredible director, and also being having the cinematography, the DP on this is Roger Deakins, who is a legendary cinematographer. Like 50, 60 years of cinematography under his belt. Some really incredible films in there, and a distinct visual style. Together, along with all the other elements, they deliver a truly incredible film. And from very early on, while I was watching it, I was trying to figure out how I could summarize what I was watching, because it's difficult. It's a very complex film, not necessarily in the text, but in the metatextual sense, it's very dense. But there's so much beyond just the direct content. There's, all the things, film is such an amalgamation of different media, sound and visuals and acting and writing and all these other things that really have to come together and synergize. And it's very rare, that even in there's lots of quite good movies where not all those things quite match up. I'm not going to go so far as to say, oh, this is, a perfect film, but it's extremely good. And I was trying to figure out how to summarize my sort of emotional experience, and the experience of watching the film. And from rather early on, I had this idea, and it's sort of held through to the end, is the idea that this film is a series of beautiful pictures of ugly things. And every element of the film really goes to deliver on that. I've already talked a lot about the directing and the cinematography. I'll come back to it a little bit more. There are some truly stunning shots in this film, but the content therein and the content that's being addressed is so troubling, to say the least, at points, that the juxtaposition is all the more stark as a result. So, um, the writing is really incredible as well. Uh, it is infrequent that a script is written with a deft hand. More often than not, you can at least find some elements that are just overwritten or over delivered or generally do too much. And many of my favorite films are the ones that are, as you've probably picked up on if you've been watching this show for a while, are scripts that know when to shut up and not tell you anything or not tell you much. Scripts that have a deft hand in letting you in on the story when it's appropriate and keeping you in the dark when it's appropriate. There's some really fascinating stuff that I didn't really even pick up on until after I was, thinking, I finished it about half an hour ago. But thinking back on my experience of watching it and realizing some of the structural elements that I didn't recognize in the moment while watching it. There's some really fascinating stuff in terms of sort of a floating camera, narratively speaking, where at the beginning of the film, it seems like you're following one character. And throughout the film, it slowly eases you into following multiple characters or following no one at all. And that is also something that I think takes a very, deft and subtle hand, both in the writing and cinematically. One of the movies that it reminds me of a little bit is was Thoroughbreds. I made a comment when I was talking about that film on how the camera goes off and does its own thing, and you just sort of, it's noticeable yet unnoticeable, and there's some of that in this film as well. I do have to say, you can't help but compare this film to others. If you watch a lot of movies, you're gonna watch this and probably see parallels. The two that I drew most closely, and I think are kind of the contrasts within their similarities, make it all the more important. One is No Country for Old Men. There is some parallels content-wise, but visually speaking, it has a lot of similar but also very different visual stylings. And some of that comes down to setting and content, and some of that comes down to that was also DP'd by Roger Deakins. But all the same, while the Coen brothers are also some of my favorite directors, the things that they write, the things that they produce, the things that they direct are also very different in tone. And despite some similar visual styles at some points, I think it makes it all the more important to recognize things in Sicario that are different from No Country for Old Men. And one of those things is just the abject realism of Sicario. Now, I'm not going to get into the, nitty gritty of, hey, is this actually a thing that happens in real life? How accurate is this to, Black Ops bullshit? because frankly, it might be or it might not be, and we might not even know. Um, but in terms of tonal comparison and directorship, um, that the small differences make for vastly different experiences. No Country for Old Men is, by all accounts, a somewhat humorous film at times. There's an absurdity to it, a dark comedy, a sort of like, I don't know how to if that doesn't ring true to you, don't think I can explain what I mean by it. It's a Greek comedy, a Shakespearean comedy, in a sense. And there's a level of absurdity and sort of dramatic tragedy, that is put in there deliberately for a certain kind of flavor. And Sicario, I don't want to say it lacks that, because that makes it sound like it's missing something. On the other hand, it really goes for this sort of deeply gritty but not overwhelming understanding of the sort of dark realism of the things going on in the film, and that sort of brings me to the other comparison that I had to draw, which is Apocalypse Now, which, while being a very different sort of film, has some narrative parallels. Obviously, there's a lot of sort of layers of I'd hesitate to say some of these things, not because they're spoilers, but only because it flavors your experience. If you haven't watched the film yet, go watch this. It really is good. That there are layers of violence that are brought to the forefront and used for narrative purpose. And yet, despite being in the proverbial and literal focus of the frame, are not the point of the scene. And yet, at the same time, there is such a stark contrast between Sicario, which again sticks to this very exacting attempt at realism, versus Apocalypse Now, which delves into sort of sometimes fantastical or hallucinogenic or metaphysical elements, and again, sort of in a different direction than No Country for Old Men, gets into the absurd in a different way, and again leverages that for its own narrative ends. But Sicario, by comparison, really keeps it tight because it wants you to focus very deeply on sort of not only what's going on screen, but this meta narrative. And that sort of gets to the last thing I'm going to say about the script, which is that there is, I alluded to it before, but there's so much to unpack in this film. I mean, so much of this is innately political, and I do try and keep that out of my videos in explicit ways, just because, don't want to start fights on the internet. Who gives a shit? But as much as this film puts things in, this stark light, proverbially, that is, and wants you to see things for what they are, it also very deftly uses that to make you consider the the moral quandary of the content. The not only the ideas of the people and the places and the history behind all of the events that have led up to the events in this, in the scenes that follow, which are, the elements of the direct scenes in the film, like, it's only over a couple of days. It's not really, the content is not, this grand, it's not a grand narrative. But it really, in a lot of ways, makes you feel very small, in the realization, if you, whether you are or aren't well versed in some of the, recent or, last 100 years of history, the ramifications and the long tail that that has led to, these relatively small but intense events. I am dancing around the content of the film a little bit because I don't want to touch on any of it, because with less of this film being about metaphor than some others, I definitely don't want to tell you what goes on in the film. The exploration therein is important on its own, but the narrative beats and the process of the exploration is really what shines through so much in this film. And I think the sort of the final element of that is this this idea of dehumanization, and what does it mean to look at moral and ethical obligations and ramifications and make decisions in those environments, sometimes in ways that feel that may come off as callous or uncaring or unthinking even. And all of the characters in the film, from the top build to the people who say nothing, all really, they all have a direct connection to the narrative in a way that makes you really consider the interconnectedness of all the events and all the people, and how they may not know each other and they may not think of each other at all. And how do they affect each other's lives in ways they never know about? And it gets to, the grander things of what is the, if you're not already familiar, what is the last 100 years of history and choices made by politicians, over the last, 120, we're going to take it all the way back to like Zachary Taylor and blame him for this shit. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what do hundreds of years of history, how do those things lead into choices made in modern eras? So anyway, I've rambled a bit too much on the the meta narrative of the film, but I do think it's one of the things that really stands out. I think you can watch that. I certainly think I could watch this film multiple times, and it's not the same as some films where like each time you watch it you pick up something new. I think this is a similar thing and yet very different, in that I think every time I rewatch this I would have new things to consider about the political, social, cultural climate of the time in which we live, and what ramifications are for for me or for people around me or for people far away from me. Um, I think this is a really incredible film in a lot of ways. But I'm not done talking about it. Sorry, it sounded like I was starting to stop, but I'm not. Um, because I want to talk about the actors and some of the other content beyond just the what's on screen and more about what's on screen, I guess. Um, the film stars a number of notable names: Emily Blunt, Benicio del Toro, Josh Brolin, Daniel Kaluuya, um, and it's fascinating because both Emily Blunt and Daniel Kaluuya were not really big names prior to this. They certainly had their careers were going places, but I think I think it's probably fair to say that this was a breakout role for Emily Blunt. Um, she really shows some excellent acting chops, um, despite this being I hesitate to call it an ensemble cast, but there's so much going on in the film that it's not like um, she's not the main character. Um, and yet, despite surprisingly, you know, her the times that she's on screen can be broken up by substantial breaks in the film, but every time she is on screen, she puts on a very good performance. Um, you know, it's a very limited it's a film that's very limited in scope, but within the scope of the film, I think she really puts on a great performance for her character. Um, Daniel Kaluuya, I didn't even know he was in this film. He's not top billed at all. He actually arguably was more well known than Emily Blunt was, I think, at the time of the film's release, although mostly in Britain. He is a British actor. Now, of course, he just got an Academy Award, well earned, and has been in a whole bunch of other things that have gotten him a lot more visibility. But he should not be undersold. His performance, again, somewhat limited, somewhat of a supporting role, but like really excellent. And I, I've always been impressed with his ability to do a variety of accents, especially a convincing American accent. I'm just gonna use say blanket American, and not tie it to any particular place, but like puts on a great performance. You know, becomes a very believable character in a very short amount of time, and I really appreciated that. That performance of his. Benicio del Toro is pretty good. There are some elements of it that feel a little, I don't know. There's some elements that feel just like Benicio del Toro. Um, it's he doesn't to me have the greatest acting range, but I think he is well cast in this, and delivers a pretty darn good show. There's some elements of it that I could take it or leave it, but none of them are like bad at all. Josh Brolin actually might be the weakest character. I'm not the biggest fan of Josh Brolin in the first place. But he's also a little bit one note. Some of that is deliberate. It's written into the character, but some of it feels a little like, I don't know. I don't want to say phoned in, but it feels a little like he wasn't sure quite what to do with the character. a little disappointing. But like I said, none of the performances are bad by any means. They all serve they all serve perfectly well, if not better. The one other thing I really want to talk about is the the music and the sound design. Um, this was scored by Johan Johansson, who has collaborated multiple times with Denis Villeneuve. Um, he's probably one of my favorite modern score composers. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, despite being relatively young. So that's very unfortunate because I think he probably would have been pretty legendary. But his score for this film is extremely good. It is very much in his sort of his wheelhouse in terms of the musical design and the sound design together are very much sort of consistent with his some of his other work, but I think it fits extremely well. And the sound design as well, with I think one notable exception that sort of stuck out like a sore thumb. There's like one sound effect in the whole movie where I'm like, really? But the sound design is super important in this film, and I think it's done quite well. Not not the best I've ever heard, but like it's very good. So I always like to credit music and sound design where I can, especially since I feel like every once in a while I have to be the one who calls out and says, no, part of the reason this thing was bad was because of the sound design. But yeah, here I get to compliment it for once, so I'm very happy about that. Anyway, yeah. Apparently there is a all right, well, not I don't say that I shouldn't say apparently. I knew there was a sequel to this film. It is not the same director. It has some of the same actors, but not all of them. I will probably watch it at some point, but probably not put it onto this channel. But yeah, as for this one, as a succinct whole, I highly recommend it. Even for all of the Academy Award nominations that it got, and the relative level of success that I had, I still think it's something that got not nearly as much visibility as it should have. I think it's extremely good, and if you can stomach the content, it's really excellent. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.